Well, a very good morning to you from wherever you're tuning in from. Thank you for making time. My name is Jesse Rogers. Welcome to today's edition of News Center. We're coming to you live from from Kenya's capital, Nairobi, the host of the Africa Climate Summit that just concluded yesterday after 3 days of intense deliberations where various stakeholders, heads of state, and players within the climate space actually converged at the Kenyatta International Convention Center, KICC, to deliberate on Africa's next step on matters climate change. At the end of that summit, we saw President William Ruto, the host president, lead other heads of state in what was called the Nairobi Declaration, even as we shift focus to the COP28 summit that will be hosted at the end of this year in the United Arab Emirates. So has Africa positioned itself strategically after that Africa Climate Summit? What needs to be done to ensure that the big players actually hold their pledges, hold their contributions in terms of climate financing? We'll be talking about this and a lot more, evaluating the hits and misses of the Africa Climate Summit, which was the first of its kind to be held right here in the continent. And equally, we'll try and interrogate the link between climate change and gender matters, not just in the country, but in the region as well. And in case you haven't grabbed yourself a copy of Kenya's Bold newspaper today, it goes big with some of the key take-homes from the Africa Climate Summit. Of course, a lot to do with climate financing, where a pledge worth $26 billion was made during the Africa Climate Summit. Will this money go for the intended purposes? Will it actually be implemented? This is a question all to do with the game of wait and see. But it's clear that African heads of state are determined to hold the global community accountable in terms of their role in addressing the climate-related challenges we're facing in the continent. I'm joined by two esteemed guests. Allow me to introduce them. Definitely players within the climate change space, even as they illustrate to us the interlink between climate change and matters agenda. I'll start with the lady on my immediate left. Asante sana for your time. Eunice Musime is joining us. She's from Uganda. She is the executive director of Akina Mama wa Africa, and she's also the chairperson of the Federation of Uganda Women Lawyers. Karibu sana. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Asante. Good morning.
Have you enjoyed your time in Kenya so far?
Yes, I've enjoyed my time.
Yes.
It has been enriching.
Definitely looking forward to more deliberations. Asante for your time. Equally joined by Mwanahamisi Singano, who is from Tanzania. She is the Senior Global Policy Lead at WEDO, and equally the co-focal point Women and Gender Constituency. And she's an African feminist who is passionate about fighting structural and intersecting inequalities while equally contributing to a more just, equal, fairer, and sustainable world. Mwanahamisi, karibu sana.
Asante, niwe karibia.
My Swahili is not too good, but nashukuru. Asante for your time.
Asante sana.
So I'm pretty sure you were in the thick of it in terms of the Africa Climate Summit. And I've mentioned time and time again, this was the first of its kind. So much pomp and color, and equally so much expectations going into this particular summit, bearing in mind we're setting pace ahead of the COP28 summit later on in the year. Eunice, I'd like to begin with you. What were your expectations going into this particular summit? And the quick question would be, were they met? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my expectation coming here to Nairobi was that our leaders would raise or elevate their ambition to see that they actually make a dent in the climate crisis, because it's one of the biggest crises that we are currently facing. And so for our leaders, our African presidents, this is something that is top priority on their list.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see that they are actually making the demands that they need to be made. So what I would say is that, one, I was very excited to see that many African leaders actually showed up. So for me, that showed and signaled a strong commitment to this cause. Yeah. And when they did show up, it was also important to see that in their statements, they were quite categorical in stating that this is a crisis that African presidents, they as presidents, heads of states and government, need to pay greater attention to. It also was a great signal for us to see that we had our own African space where African presidents come and they are able to develop a common position that they will take to the COP. President Ruto was very categorical in stating that this is going to be their position. And I do hope that when the declaration is actually is adopted by even those that were not here in Nairobi, that it will be a common, because that's what we've been asking and hoping to see, that Africa speaks with a stronger voice, a collective voice on this crisis that is affecting not just us but globally. So to that extent, my expectations were met. Of course, there were also misses. The miss for Africa to actually make a stronger demand on the debt crisis. So we have a climate crisis, but we also have a debt crisis. All the resources that African governments collect from us, the citizens, a majority of that are going to paying debt. And you know, this is odious debt also. So that was a miss, in my opinion, in terms of ensuring that actually African governments and heads of state are calling for debt cancellation. So there was conversation around restructuring, give us a bit more time. But that's not what we need. What we need is we need relief. We need debt relief. So for me, that was a miss. And yeah, we can continue the conversation.
Okay, and perhaps the African heads of state should have been more vocal about the debt distress. But I remember President William Ruto talking about the economic, how did he term it? But he definitely talked about the debt distress. Mwanahamisi, as I cross over to you, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni wasn't present, but it's proper to note that the Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu was definitely there. How was this Africa Climate Summit in terms of the hits and misses? How would you describe the 3-day event?
So I think, like Eunice should start saying that I think most of the Africans who work in climate spaces really had a huge expectation about the summit. For the longest time, as Africans, we have asked for our leader to convene other African leader on our own terms, on our own land, because for the longest time we have been convened by others. So you will see, for example, a US-Africa summit, or you will be convened at the margin of United Nations General Assembly, or at the margin of UNFCCC. But since we had the heads of the state committee, because Africa, I think, is one of the regions that we have the highest level of committee, which is the President Ruto is chairing CAHOSC, Committee of Heads of the State on Climate Change. So that is the supreme body within the African Union. And we have been asking, can the leaders and the committee himself take the leadership of convening African leaders in African soil, on African terms, for African to discuss issues related to climate change. So when this meeting was announced, it was a huge celebration from across the board, from civil society to government to different academicians, that finally we have our own space. We are not invited to some of the space. But in the course of organizing the summit, I think you have heard there was a lot of frustrations, especially on how the foreign interest captured the summit, how the summit was organized. The secretariat team was full of colleagues who are seconded by different international organizations. There is a lot of concerns around accreditation. There's a lot of concerns around who got side events. And there was actually, I think, African-led side events where almost 30% were about, and majority of those side events were given to multinational, international organizations. So in the course of the summit, that excitement that this is our African summit sort of like fed away, because issues. And potentially folks knew the importance of this conversation, and that's why they wanted to capture it. So it was disappointing a bit to us that the process pushed Africans, and it becomes more of the elite conversation. It's about leaders, it's about the private sector, it's about the donor, and less about the mamambogas, and less about the hustlers, and less about the women and young people, etc. So that was a huge miss. And from women perspective and indigenous people perspective, we really had to fight hard for our voices to be heard inside the summit. We have succeeded in some cases, but not so much. And I think for us, moving forward, we are really hoping our leaders will learn from this, because as civil society, we've been very categorical and vocal that regardless of the outcome, participation is also key. Process justice is key. You cannot tell me that I'm not going to include you so long as my final outcome will have a word about you. We want to be on the table. You want to be on those halls. So I think it was a missed opportunity to really showcase diversity of the African knowledge, African skills, African innovation, African voices, and that was a completely miss.
So do you think the climate summit was taken over by Western agenda?
Yes.
So what should have we done, perhaps to ensure, because we equally had a couple of Kenyans and equally others from the region hold something called the Real Summit, which was on the People's Summit, which was on the sidelines. Is it possible to have every stakeholder on the table in an ideal situation, or is it not practical?
It's very possible.
It's possible to have a fair representation. But where you see that a certain category is missing totally, then that's not fair representation. So fair and equitable representation. So the question is, did we have a fair and equitable representation? You would say no, and you can just quickly get the agenda of the meeting and you quickly see who was scheduled to speak.
Okay.
And I think just to add up, if you look at the summit has arguably welcomed more than 20,000 people. More than 20,000 people, you can have a fair representation of different groups. But if the government and the development partner and the companies and corporation took 95% of delegation, the claim that we cannot have everyone then hold some water.
Okay, fair enough. I think that's one of the sticky issues that need to be ironed out a little bit later on. But now let's talk about matters inclusion. And we just ran a story a little bit earlier on where the health sector was a little bit up in arms due to the non-inclusion within the Africa Climate Summit. I know this might not be a forte, matters health, but in terms of what you're specialized in, be it law, be it matters climate advocacy and whatnot, was the inclusion aspect taken care of, especially when it comes to women who play a part in the space around climate change? Was that space taken care of?
So thank you. So of course, when we got the document, as a feminist, the first thing I had to quickly peruse and see to what extent is it actually capturing our feminist agenda. And so of course, the word women is mentioned in the introduction, and thereafter there's nothing about that. And it's not that I'm equating gender with women, I'm just saying that it's very important to recognize that women are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. When you think about a drought, when you think about floods, when you think about displacement, the people who are mostly affected and have to actually do a lot of the care work are women. And so there has to be a special recognition that women, youth, indigenous persons that are actually most affected by this crisis there's going to be greater attention paid to them. But beyond that inclusion, it's also important to assess and say that in the resolutions we are making, how are they catering? How are they addressing the root cause of this crisis? So I'll give an example. In terms of fair and equitable representation, we know that even with this climate issue, those who make decisions, the women are excluded. So they are not part of decision making. That needs to come out strongly to say that there's going to be intentionality in ensuring that women are well represented in negotiating tables, in proffering solutions, and not have other people speak on our behalf, because we have the lived experience, the lived reality, and so we cannot have someone like Mishi has said, the process justice. So yes, so I would say a quick review, quick perusal of that shows that there wasn't sufficient and adequate attention to our feminist concerns.
So you've definitely explained the interlinkage between climate change and women. And it goes without saying, if you're not on the table, you're part of the menu. So we definitely want more involvement from women. As you add to that, Mwana Hamisi, or Mishi, as she's called you.
Yes, you can use that one.
That's totally fine.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the climate summit and what it meant for marginalized communities. And we saw some of them involved in giving the declaration, various groups, including children and youth. But focused on marginalized communities because they play a part in protecting the ecosystem, and that makes them the primary actors in this fight against climate change. What was their stake in the Africa Climate Summit? How should it have been addressed, and was it addressed in the right way?
Okay, so I think before responding to that, if I could just add what Eunice said. In fact, in the process of organizing the summit, we had, as part of the work that we're doing, because there's assumption that women are not organized. So women were organized, and because of that, we were able to have relationship or interaction with the summit leadership in terms of, let's see, you and the secretariat, but also the government. And one of the things that we asked earlier on and persistently is to have access to the declaration in the drafting team. We say, even if you won't invite us, we need to be on the table, but at very least, can you share the document? Because if you adopt this document, it has to be on behalf of Africans, and African voices need to be heard. So we did receive a draft declaration, and when we received that draft declaration, we did mobilize and review that declaration, and we make sure that issues related to gender were centered, and we made sure that draft enters to the secretaries officers and drafting team. So to see the final draft or final declaration now with no gender, it's not that they didn't know the issue. It's not that they didn't have the language. It's somebody deliberately and intentionally deleted the language. So we really want to own the process and say we did our part. We didn't wait to see what will they think of us? Even though we were not in the room, we managed to mobilize outside and making sure that we have a technical language, not just for us, for every woman in the continent, for every girl, and for every community, because women hold those communities. But it is unfortunately that that language was deleted, which is sort of like double the pain, you know? I know that you didn't include me, you just think you didn't think about this, then that's disappointing. But if I know, like I sent my proposition and you ignore that or deleted that's hard a little bit. And in terms to your question, in terms of the inclusion, different groups, we also, as women, we are part of non-state actors grouping. And within that umbrella, we are able to organize and we are able to stand in solidarity in the community with other groups, because we do know that oppression of one group is the oppression of the other. Right? So we worked in that community. And because of that space inside being closed, most of the group organized outside. So we had indigenous people organized from the outside. We have young people organized from outside. We have faith group organized. We have women. And all of them came up with their own declaration and found the way to bring those declarations inside. So for example, for women, we organized on Sunday and we handed over declaration to the Minister of Gender, because minister had an access to the inside conversation, equally with the children and equally with indigenous and with the youth. So looking now at declaration, the draft that we have now, or the document that we have now,
Yeah.
there is recognition of the role of indigenous people. There is recognition, mention of the role of young people. As Eunice said, the recognition of women is sort of like inferred either in those community or indigenous people, not categorically mentioned. And it's a step in the right direction, but I think we could do more than just mentioning.
Okay.
We could be categorical, and what I think is lacking in declaration, especially on aspect of inclusion, is to be intentional of what our African government are committing to do to make sure that we change this situation. There is no fantasy in having marginalized group. Like, these are not situations that need to be permanent. And it is at the interest of all African heads of the state to make sure we get to the point where we don't have marginalized groups, right? Especially in the context of climate change.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a deliberate attention and efforts and programs that will make sure that our people are not dying because of climate crisis. The same way we make commitment that we are going to eradicate hunger, we are going to eradicate poverty, we need to be in a position to say we are committing by this year, we are going to do everything we can that our community will not suffer from climate change. There will be no vulnerable group when it comes to impact of climate change, and that is what we want, because it's not a situation that we really want to continue.
Do you think the goodwill is there? Political governance goodwill? Are we heading in the right direction? Because we well know how important it is, especially in the African context, that we have the goodwill of the leaders in power. Is it there?
I don't think so. And even if we have, the goodwill doesn't get the work done. Like, you need the goodwill, if at all the goodwill is there, we need the goodwill to be translated to commitment, to policy, to action, to programs, right?
Yeah.
So we cannot keep on saying that we have goodwill. I think part of the problem is we have normalized vulnerability. We feel because I came from the poverty-stricken family, we use this saying, humble beginning. Like, humble beginning has been a qualifier of, like it's like an adjective we use, that I'm coming from humble beginning. My poverty is my badge of honor. My vulnerability is my badge of honor. Because of that, we normalize that. What we're failing to understand, those conditions now, added with the climate crisis, is a life and death. Is somebody losing their life? Is somebody losing their dignity? Is somebody losing their ability to earn any income? Is child losing access to education? Is a mother losing ability to have a fair or safe health care or maternal health care? Is everything.
Okay. That's interesting. And since you brought up a saying, I'll do the same as well as I cross over to you, Eunice. They say all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I'll twist it. All talk but no pay makes Africa a dull country, if I could put it that way. And the headline today shows how much money was pledged, roughly 26 billion during the Africa Climate Summit. And we're having a conversation where the developed countries are being criticized for pledging but not walking the talk. So how do we ensure that these countries who have brought us advanced effects of climate change actually pull their weight in this whole climate discourse?
Thank you. Indeed, you have to put your money where your mouth is. So it's not enough to pledge. The pledges must be made. And there are organizations that actually track the money to find out how much of those pledges are actually coming through. And so one of the reasons, of course, I suspect personally why we had that capture is because developed countries know that the African states are organizing themselves to really push back on this continuous pledging and not being able to deliver on that. And that's something we can also hold their feet to and say there's an annual pledge of USD 100 billion. You have to meet it. And because we've contributed the least to the climate crisis. And so one of the phrases we use is that there has to be a collective, but there has to be responsibility. We need to hold the developed countries. They need to be held to their responsibility to ensure that they address the adverse effects that we are facing when we've contributed the least. There was even a time when there was that trying to tweak that Africa's emissions are rising so that there can be some form of, maybe to make them feel good that, yeah, it's not just us who are polluting. But we know, and actually there's also another principle that says the polluter pays. So that's a categorical demand. The polluter pays. And so we need to be able to make that demand. And that's what we are trying to see. For COP28, there's a huge conversation on loss and damage. Yeah, so we can't continue shouldering the loss and the damage when you continue to pollute. And my colleague Mishi is going to speak about the carbon markets and the nuances therein that need to be unpacked.
But before we cross over to Mishi, in terms of accountability, the few monies that we have received so far, are they going to the intended purposes? Because at times our weak link as African countries, and perhaps speaking for Kenya, is the issue about corruption, money not going to the intended purposes. Are we doing enough to ensure that we don't siphon money in any way, shape or form?
Of course, accountability is important because once the monies are well utilized, then we'll begin to see the shifts that we need to see in terms of climate change or in terms of addressing the climate crisis. So accountability is important, and actors that work on transparency, accountability, need to continuously work around that. But the bigger actually issue is part of that money that is pledged comes in as loans, which actually further compounds our vulnerabilities, because then you're causing the distress that we are facing. And that then, of course, spirals into all these failures that we are seeing around us. So you're further making African countries, because the truth of the matter is that African states have weak institutions. So unless we are beginning to work on strengthening our own institutions, then you will redress accountability issues with systems in place. But if a country is facing a debt crisis, a climate crisis, an economic crisis, we are perpetually, you cannot think and innovate within crises. So that's the problem.
Interesting. Mishi, just briefly, there seems to be yet another scramble for Africa. Not too long ago when I was in school, I was reading about, the colonization and scramble for Africa. Right now, so much emphasis in the African continent. Why is this? What is making Africa so strategic in the fight against climate change that we need to be on the table, that we are trying to reevaluate our statements? And we had from President Ruto in terms of, we are pulling our own weight. It's not just about asking for funds. We're equally trying to see what we can do with the little resources or much resources we have to enable this altogether journey. What say you about this scramble for Africa? What makes us so special?
Thank you so much. Again, before I come to that, I will really want to add on the question of money. We have been very categorical. What we are asking is the new and additional money. It's not recycled money. It's not statistical acrobats. And the Global North has been so good in recycling commitment and doing all the statistical acrobat. So this money that has been pledged, you will be no surprised if half of it has been pledged in the different conferences and another conferences and another conferences. So it's the same money that they will package, they will add from when they are pledging during the SDG, they will say this is development money, and then we'll add something green, and they say now we are committing this to new money in the climate finance. So there's a lot of that, and that's why we really need to track the resources that are coming. Most of the resources that are coming in the form of climate finance come from bilateral engagement, and that is what we have seen. And that poses a specific challenge in terms of accountability and tracking, because if the coming is, this is the commitment from Kenya and EU, then those contracts becomes like between those two countries. And that's why we continue to say we have institution, we have GCF, Green Climate Fund. Why can they deliver their commitment within this framework so that we are able to track every cent? Where does it come from and where does it go? Rather than an country giving money to their private sector to come and do a small project here, and they say we have already contributing our 100 million in support of the climate action in Kenya. Okay. But in real sense, that's the money going to their private sector to do some work for profit in X countries. So that, I think, is that's where we are really we are not celebrating those commitments, because they are really recycled. So in terms of your question, what's special? Unfortunately, I think for the longest time, Africa has been very categorical, and they want to appreciate the work of our African Group of Negotiators, AGN, for being absolutely resolute on the role that Africa played in the climate crisis and responsibilities of the global north. Mm-hmm. And again, in terms of the hits of this declaration, having that language clearly on the declaration that Africa still wants to hold the principle of collective but differentiated responsibility is one of the important language that we see in this declaration. So because of that, African government have pushed Global North to deliver their commitment. And their commitment in terms of cutting the emission and providing finance. Okay. So what happened is the Global North decided to shift the narrative. They said, Africans, when you are coming here, you are begging. And you are begging us. So asking for what is rightfully African become begging. And it is unfortunately that narrative of African is begging the Global North is now at the heads of our African leaders. To the extent we are saying, oh, we don't want to be seen as beggars anymore. Now we have to be seen as eco players. Now we have to pull our own weight. Right. So in that case, all that we are doing for us to say, oh, we are going to do this, we are going to open our market, it's servicing the narrative of the Global North, because we have been pushed them so hard to fulfill the obligation, and they are not ready to do that. They create a narrative that we now own it, to the extent now we're saying, no, we are not going to push you anymore. We are going to be eco partner. Can you come and invest? So we are no longer talking the language of you have a responsibility to pay. You have destroyed my community, should pay for it. I'm not begging. It's the rightful ask that you committed you will do, and you need to deliver it.
Well, as she said, the polluter pays, huh?
Of course.
Anyway, allow us to take a short break. We'll continue with the discussion a little bit after the short break, even as we continue focusing on the Africa Climate Week that is still ongoing right here in Nairobi. As we come back, I'll put them to task to explain what exactly is carbon credits. I'm sure you've heard of this term time and time again. And should Africa actually look into this as an untapped potential? Is it good for the continent? Well, the ladies are here. We'll discuss that after this short break. Stay with us.